Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so excited for our discussion today. Welcome to our third episode of Life Talks. Today we have several panelists. They are a mixture of college students, interns, and parents with specific experiences. So I'm really excited about having this conversation. In this episode, we'll be talking about celebrating the strength of ethnicity and being able to combat the negative biases and associations with brown body individuals. I want to really focus on how do we increase a positive sense of self and build a sense of self in brown and Black and multi-ethnic children and families. I'm your host, Kamyala Howard of Life Talks. I want to start today by introducing each of my panel, or having my panel introduce themselves, and maybe just talk a little bit about their background and how they self-identify. So let's start with Elsa. Elsa, would you introduce yourself and maybe talk a little bit about your background and how you self-identify?
Sure. I'm Elsa Carlson, and I'm a white woman, and I have 4 children that are, I would say, I think they all identify as Black, and they're every shade that it could be. My youngest has blue eyes and pretty straight hair, but she's very adamantly like, I am Black because I know my dad and I know my family. But let's see. A little bit of background. I have, like I said, I have 4 kids. I work in an early childhood nonprofit and in policy and advocating for just the different things that we need to do to make sure that all children have equal access.
And I'm going to ask you a little bit more after everybody introduces themselves, but just going into the variations of all your children identifying as Black and how did they get there. So I think that's a very interesting start. Let's start, move on to either Nia or Michaela. Which one of you guys would like to start off with introducing yourself?
Okay. Well, my name is Michaela Overton, and I identify as a Black woman. Is that all you want to know?
If that's how you identify, then that's all I want to know. Do you want to say a little bit about your profession? Are you a college student, an intern?
Okay, yeah. I'm a college student at the illustrious HBCU, Norfolk State University. I am also an intern right now for Flaherty Foundation. It is a scholarship foundation. And I'm the communications intern because my major is mass communications. So a little bit what I do is I basically interview students that are doing like notable things or like really big things. So I interview them and I make posts about their accomplishments. So yeah.
And I think it was really great to have Nia and Michaela on as attending a historical Black college and just their different experiences of having an educational background that the curriculum is focused on brown pride and Black pride and increasing their self-identity. So I'm really interested in just knowing your different experiences. I've shared with the audience that I went to the University of Minnesota and I had to create that. I had to get a minor in African American studies in order just to see teachers and professors and curriculums that was about me. It took extra time. So I'm really eager to hear about you guys' experiences today. And we have Nia. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Nia Davis. I also am a student. Me and Michaela go to the same school, Norfolk State University, and I am studying business management right now.
Awesome. You guys have picked some tough majors. And last but not least, Tess is going to introduce ourselves. Tess is an intern with Children of Incarcerated Caregivers, is the partner agency of We're Divine, and a co-host of Life Talk episodes. So Tess, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm Tess Falgren. I'm a white woman from Montana originally. I am a graduate student in creative writing at the University of Minnesota, and I got involved with Children of Incarcerated Caregivers last winter, just writing the newsletter. And I've been working with Cami on putting this video series out, and I've been having a really lovely time seeing her be such a amazing host and discussion leader. It's been really cool.
And I'm so excited. Tess is normally behind the scenes. So today is the first day that she's participating. So I'm equally excited having Tess here. So we'll start like we always do, just with a conversation and a few questions. I really wanted to start this episode about how we self-identify. And it made me think about the Black Lives Matter and even people connecting it with a movement. And I was just home in Minnesota a few days ago, and I had one of my favorite t-shirts on. It said Black, Educated, and Bougie. And I was inside one of the malls. And one of the salespersons in the mall said, well, what does that shirt mean? I said, well, it describes me. I'm Black, I'm educated, and I'm a little bougie. And he said it with kind of unconsciousness. And I don't think he had any intentional malice. But he said, I just wanted to know because I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing another trend. And that sat with me because I never thought or ever want my culture, my race to be a trend. The way that I self-identify is something that I've lived with all of my life. There are a lot of positive things about being and self-identifying as a Black woman. There are a lot of negative stereotypes that happens to us. But I want to make sure these conversations are happening, that you're understanding that lives are being impacted. And this is a community, and these are children, and it's not a trend. So I had to sit back for a while and really think about even talking about Black Lives Matter. It's not a movement. It is about people's lives. It's about putting seeds of greatness into our brown and Black children in the future. And it's not a trend. And I think the more that we have conversations like this, the more that we prepare community members, allies, and parents to normalize conversations about race, we can get that misconception about brown and Black individuals being the trend. So I thought that was just something that was, wow, it sat with me. And that he even repeated it to say, I just don't want to miss a trend. So I want to ask you guys, beyond how you self-identify, what are some ways that you felt like your race, whether you identifying as an ally or a white body person or a parent, Elsa, of 4 Black children, or you, Nia or Michaela, identifying as African-American Black women, how has that impacted you in your life, as a student, as a professional, as an intern? How has race either created opportunities or created barriers? So let's think about it for a minute. How has race impacted you as a parent, intern, student? How has it maybe created some opportunities? And how has it created some barriers in your life? Would anybody like to start with that question?
I can start.
Okay, thanks, Nia.
I definitely identify as a young Black woman. And I feel like how that can kind of create a barrier is an example that just kind of came to my head is for the last summer, I worked at Noodles and Company over by Lake Calhoun. Mm-hmm. And I feel like one barrier that we have to deal with is, you know, being the only Black person in a room, like in a certain setting. And that kind of creates barriers of how us as African Americans, we have to know how to code switch, whether we're in a professional setting, a setting, you know, it's just us and our homegirls, or like a setting with, you know, a teacher. I feel like that can definitely create a barrier, and some of those, that communication can get confused sometimes.
Do you feel like it's something that's put on you, and if you didn't code switch, what would happen?
I feel like for working with my coworkers, like they don't really know the real me. So I feel like not code switching, they would kind of look at me different because, you know, they don't understand, you know, certain words we use that if I was just talking to Michaela, you know, she would understand, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I think we talked about that in a previous a previous episode about not being allowed to be your authentic self. Yes. And that there's risk for some of us being our authentic selves. But these episodes were created so we can learn that being our authentic self is the only self that we need to be. And even if society is rejecting that authentic self, we are deserving of bringing our whole self to the environment. And these environments need to learn how to adapt to us. Right. And I talked in the past about my journey. It took about 30 years for me to finally be my authentic self in all environments. I had to do a lot of code switching, especially as a professional, going to the University of Minnesota, being the only student. There were so many times that I was the only that it became absolutely draining and exhausting of what hair am I gonna wear today? You know, I changed my hair a lot, my dialect, or my decibels more softer, so I won't be perceived as aggressive or as angry. But I started to think, well, why am I doing the shifting and adapting? Why do I have to change for the others, for the majority? And when I realized that it wasn't my barrier to carry or the barrier I created or my load to hold, it felt like a newfound found freedom, that I was able to just bring my whole self in every walk of life, in every arena. I don't change who I am, whether it's professional, whether it's personal. But that took a long time. It took me to build a self-confidence of myself, and really believe no matter what environment I'm in, that I get to be all of me and I get to bring all of me. So you young women, as you are transitioning into your professionalhood, I hope you find a balance of bringing and being your authentic self. Michaela, would you like to talk a little bit about your experience with race and how that has impacted you?
Yeah, sure. Kind of to maybe piggyback a little bit off of what you and Nia were talking about. I kind of find it a little frustrating that I've been trying, or we have to try to assimilate into their culture like all the time. And like,
what do you mean by their? Who is the they?
I'm talking about white people.
Okay.
Like I'm talking about like, because they hold the standard of like what we're supposed to be like, what we're supposed to dress, how we're supposed to talk, how we're supposed to act, you know, around professional settings. Because it's like, it's almost as if the white way is the professional way. Yeah. And that's just a little upsetting that it's still like that in 2020. And I also find it upsetting that going to an HBCU, I'm always having to defend my HBCU because it is an HBCU. Defend as in having to remind people that I am receiving a worthy education. Wow. They're not teaching me anything that you don't know, like that. They're not teaching me anything that, well, they're teaching me everything that I need to know. How about that? Yeah. It's like that when they look at Black education, they compare it to bad education. It's always something negative compared to Black, like Black hair. We were told that it wasn't beautiful. We were told that, you know, it was nappy and stuff. You know, when we think of nappy, we think of bad, wrong. No, we shouldn't. That's our hair. You know? So yeah, I hate that I'm always having to defend HBCU education and Black education, because I only went to this school because I wanted to learn more about myself and my people. I wanted to, you know, be around my culture. So yeah.
I think that is so beautifully said. And just to talk about the negative associations, even with the word Black, it made me think about the other day when a Black cat crossed my path. It was literally me and my best friend in the car. And she stopped and swerved. And I'm like, well, what are you doing? She's like, well, that's a Black cat and that's bad luck. And I'm like, I thought we were all taught that as kids, but why? Because it's Black and it's associated with something negative or some kind of powerful evil force is going to come because a Black cat has crossed our path. So even these things that are put in our daily messages as kids, Black has been associated from the beginning as something negative and not worthy. And then it made me think about what you're saying about HBCU, historically Black colleges and universities. I would say you're given even more education because you're given the standards of the University of Minnesota, the big top 10 universities, and also you're getting the standards of what it means to be a brown body person in society. What does it mean to be a brown body person navigating professional relationships? What does it mean for our history, our culture, and moving forward? And that's something that can't be replicated. It's something that a lot of individuals don't get to be exposed to. And by both you guys attending that, you're getting even more education. But you're absolutely right. We live in a society that even the amount of resources that Black colleges get are lower. When athletes are graduating from high school, they go to those Big Ten colleges because they follow the money. And so at what point do we stop these cycles and we hold individuals accountable for distributing more resources in HBCUs or encouraging our youth that are athletes to attend those HBCUs? So we can build the resources because they're accredited. The curriculum is amazing, and just the pride of building your self-esteem from the beginning. And I light up every time I talk about that because I didn't get that at the U, but when I travel down south and I attend, you know, your homecomings and just having that beautifulness and pride of our community in every walks of life on campus, I think makes a difference. So thank you for sharing that, Michaela and Nia. Also, do you want to talk a little bit about, because you're holding a lot as a white body mom, and you're an ally, and you're a protector, and your children self-identify as African American. So tell me how race has impacted your family, whether be it barriers or created positive senses of self. What is the impact of race?
So I guess I want to say that I didn't really, obviously, for like many people that are white, don't have to think about race until, for many people, it's maybe never. And I feel like I found like a box of journals at some point from when I was really young, and I was noticing things very young. And talking to my mom, she said I always noticed things that, I grew up on the East Coast, but in Maine, so it was very white, but I still was paying attention, and I was still writing about these things that really upset me. So I think that this was always like in my heart. Like, I understood injustice, I understood inequalities and things that were not fair, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But then having my first son, I had him young. I was 18, and the first time he was called the N-word, I was pregnant. And so it didn't even take very long for me to realize, like, kind of what was going to play out for him as a Black male in our country. And having worked in education in his young life and having been a student, I didn't really notice it when he was young, but then as soon as he was about 6 or 7 years old, things started to change in education and his schooling setting. And I was mystified. I could not understand, like, why were these people treating him the way that they were? You know, I was an educator at that time, so how could you be an educator and then treat children this way? It just did not make sense to me. And I started working with a person in our school district, and she was an older Black woman, and she was like, look, there's nothing else to it. Like, this is what, when you peel away all the other layers of whatever's happening and nothing else makes sense, you know, we have to look at, is this racism, and what else could it be? Mm-hmm. And I was just like, my heart split open, my mind split open, and I was just like, having worked in a very diverse schooling setting as my work, I just couldn't believe people would work in a setting educating kids where they may encounter any kind of kid, and we're only a couple miles out of the city. So it really just like opened me up to the vastness of what is real. And you know, fast forward to like him being 10, he was basically almost suicidal by the time he was 10, based on just the school that he was in, like wearing him down little by little, really just watching him for every little infraction, whatever it might have been, having him tally it on his desk. No matter how hard he worked, he would just get a C, and he felt it. I mean, it was really wearing him down. And you know, it's just been a really, for him, he's in college now, he's 20, and it never ended. Like, he's still experiencing it, not as often, but through his high schooling. And that is when his experience is what really opened me up to like the vastness of what this would look like. And then of course, when he started driving was when Philando got killed, and we had to have the talks. But even prior to that, we were talking about, like, you're not going to get away with things that your white friends do at school or in this, you know, in the neighborhood. And I just don't think it really hit him until, you know, it was like little by little. And so then I had a daughter. Her experience has been different, but it's been more academic, where they put her in lower groups than she's supposed to be in. So, I mean, he had that too, but hers has been more on that side, where they just kind of doubted her intelligence a little bit more. And now she's 14, and the kids that are, I mean, I think what's happening now has really brought out her experience a little bit more, because there's just been some white boys that have been like, we experience more than you. And she's like, excuse me, like, I don't understand how you can say that. And thankfully she has friends that have said, she's not proving this to you, she's not going to explain this to you, like, you just need to accept that this is what it is. But you know, it's exposed itself very differently. And now I think my younger two, I feel like they've had a more positive experience in our school district just because they're in a different school and it's more diverse, and we were more prepared for it, I think, to prepare them ahead of time. Whereas I was still really naive, like at, 22, and just as a parent, not even as a parent of a Black child, but, it's been a really long journey. And so he's not at an HBCU. I often wish he was, but he's in the Northwest, and he had a teacher that was just, it was really bizarre. And I was just like, drop the class. You get one withdrawal, just take it. Like, it's not worth proving yourself. You don't have to do this. And so it's just been honestly ongoing. And as a white parent, I feel like I've had to put myself completely aside and what I need as far as my own understanding and acceptance. Like, I just have to accept their reality and then try to do as much as I can to defend them and to protect them and to make sure that they're not being, I don't want to shelter them to the realities of the world, because that would be a huge injustice. And then as well, like, we're trying to kind of wrap it around and do more teaching so that it's more empowering to understand their history and, prepare them kind of on all sides to enter the world as they are.
Yeah. I mean, what you said was so powerful and yet complex, of all the things that you have to hold. And it just goes back to almost every pattern of every episode, is that brown body individuals, Black body individuals do not get the luxury of reading about racism. And we experience it very young. And you just also talking about your son at 6 and 7 and noticing these differences. And I wrote down what you were said about, is this really racism? Because we know the overt racisms, the ones that are in our face, those straight name calling to your face, but it's the covert ones that seem subtle. It's the microaggressions. It's these things that are happening from educators that are supposed to be trusting people in our children's lives, that has a lot of impression in our children's lives. And it's hard to connect that. Mm-hmm. It's hard to name that. But these are the things that are happening more often. These are the things that are happening in the schools every day and in society. It's the covert racism and we have to start naming it.
Yeah.
But as a parent, preparing your kid as early as preschool and school age, and it doesn't stop. Right. Now he's as an adult, he's having to navigate different classes and withdraw because he doesn't feel accepted. And just the ridiculous, it's absolutely ridiculous. And I also think about, I wanted to ask you, Michaela, in a minute about that, but driving, that should be the most freedom that young adults, youth should have, is driving. And for a parent, it's the most fearful independent activity ever, because we don't know once they leave that house and they turn on that ignition, if they're gonna get pulled over and they're gonna come home the next day. So we have to have, and this is why we created Life Talks too. Yes, we want to talk about strengths in our community. We want to celebrate Brown and Black pride, but preparing our children early for the biases that they're going to inherit because of the way they look. And it's not fair and it shouldn't happen, but not only we do injustice by not preparing them, we might not give them the ability to survive out of situations that they're getting into because of them being brown. So I thought of all those things.
Yeah, and some of those things, I feel like you wonder, like, am I preparing them? And especially as a white woman who did not have to think about this, I didn't have even brothers, let alone we were a white family, so we just didn't have to think about these things. And he did get pulled over at one point. It's actually pretty funny because he drove a Civic Hybrid, so very slow, older car, and he got pulled over for speeding through an intersection. He was like, I will get out, you can drive my car and try to accelerate quickly through this intersection because this car does not accelerate. And the guy was like, oh, well, you change lanes in the intersection. And then it was like another thing and another thing. And finally he was like, the cop said, well, he worked at Men's Warehouse, so he was wearing a suit, glasses, he looked very nice. And he said, well, we've had some break-ins at National Camera Center in the same strip mall. And he said, are you racially profiling me? And he was like, you can go.
Good for him for calling it out.
Because there was literally nothing else. But I feel like had nothing else, I could have really made that, I mean, not me, it could have been really a lot worse if I hadn't properly prepared him and talked about those things leading up to it. Yeah. And not that could have been a safe interaction anyway, but I think he got lucky and he named it and he, made it home. So
how did you prepare yourself as a white mother to, I mean, what supports did you have and resources? Because you're right, like all of us that are brown, we all been raised by brown individuals. And so that is something that's been passed down from, you know, generations. So you had to learn this and experience it to protect your children at the same time. So,
yeah, I think I had to strip myself of like any kind of idea that I thought I understood of how people should and shouldn't behave towards other people. Because how, you know, you expect that we expect that people will behave in the way that we will behave, I think a lot of times, especially if we have good intentions. And the truth is that's not true. And so I had to sort of put myself and my own experiences aside in order to be open to understanding what his reality and their reality will be. And it's super humbling. You know, you think, because I was in education, I thought for sure that these teachers couldn't possibly be racist until I was sitting at this table and I'm like, your teachers will never say they're racist. And then they said, well, they have, and they are. And I was like, oh, like, okay, well, now I know where I'm not sending my kids anymore. And I wish I had done more, because all I did was change the way kids got in. It had like a waiting list, and then it went to a lottery system, but they didn't change the system. And so, or the people in place. And so all they did was bring more brown and black kids into the system that was racist. And so, you know, I feel like a lot of times like, oh, I wish I would have pushed that a little bit more to help force that restructuring and kind of get out those people that are doing us damage. So yeah, you really have to, or I had to put myself aside and just really try to get in his place and their place and try to see what the realities were, so that I could just learn and start advocating and keep advocating and tirelessly advocate, because it just doesn't stop.
And I think the main thing that you said is you had to unlearn your lens and unlearn kind of the privileges that you received, inherited as a white body person, to truly understand what your children are inheriting in their experiences. And you talked a little bit about where change is going to head, and that's going to be our next question. I want to get to Tess. Tess, as an ally, as an intern entering in this field, and intentionally picking an organization like Children of Incarcerated Caregivers that work and support mostly families of color. What is your experience with the race and your role as an ally, and just maybe talk about a little bit about yourself? And you're on mute.
Sorry.
That's okay. I'm like, we don't get to hear your lovely voice.
Yeah, so I grew up in a really white place. I grew up in Montana, and I think that my parents, my mom especially, like worked really hard to prepare me for being a good ally, although probably not specifically with that in mind, you know, but taught me to just like care for everybody or whatever, like the like generalized language. But I never had to experience racism, of course, like what Elsa was saying, and basically everything I know about race and racism and anti-racism comes from reading, you know, and from making a conscious effort to learn more. And I'm still learning, like there's so much to know. And I think that like through my experiences trying to be a good ally, I have definitely learned to try to, you know, always listen is the first rule. Look for opportunities to support in whatever way that looks, and also like just like stay humble and don't get defensive, you know, and like know that like you will mess up, like I will mess up, and sometimes just by existing, like it's a violence, and that doesn't mean that there's nothing I can really do. I can't not be white in a space, and sometimes that isn't welcome, and I completely understand. So yeah, it's definitely a learning experience, and I came to Minneapolis really grateful to finally have the opportunity to not be in a really whitewashed place. I feel like because of systemic racism, that's something that I never got to experience, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. Yeah.
I also think, I mean, what you just said was so powerful. And I think because you're in a different generation, even how your responses are coming off are so different. I mean, people that know, but day to day, I work with an abundance of organizations and leaders, and being able to unpack some of the privileges. And the one thing that you said is just the point that you're just existing and thinking about what that represents, the whiteness, you being in the room, just going into different spaces. And it's things that you've inherited or maybe triggering brown and black bodies by just existing and having and acknowledging that it's not even anything that you did, but it's your presence. It's what does that mean for that individual person? And that is a lot of self-awareness. I mean, there are some 40, 50-year-old individuals that don't have that much self-awareness. And I love that you said the first thing is listening, because I always think listening to understand and putting your defense mechanisms down, because it's not about the majority right now. It's finally, for the first time, Black and brown voices have gotten publicity. We've gotten together. I know in my lifetime, I've never experienced anything this unified. The solidarity, the marches were all before my time, but I see allies getting together. And I think one big factor is the age differences. I feel like the younger generation, you guys were born with more of a diverse lens and an opportunity to be more flexible and to be challenged. And I think that brings some differences, but being consciously aware of who you are and the spaces that you are in makes a huge difference. And I want to add that I often hear, and you said this before, Tess, about, well, you're learning and you're going to get things wrong, and we all are. Just because we're brown body individuals doesn't mean we know how to navigate our own skin and being in different spaces. It also doesn't mean brown body means you also understand diversity. We just know our own experiences that we've walked through. I've also learned that a lot of brown body individuals that too were born in more homogenous environments, so brown body immigrants, they don't necessarily understand the Black experience. And what I mean is that the African-American Black American experience. I was even told a few weeks ago, well, you Americans focus too much on race. And I even start to think like, well, do we focus on race because everything's Black or white? But well, that was how America was formed. And in order for us to get to be one race, we have to eliminate these barriers, these cycles of trauma. We have to eliminate these systems that continue to divide us. So we hope one day to be one race and not to talk about, and we have the privilege of not thinking about me being brown or being different. But until we start to benefit from our brownness and those that are white stop benefiting, we won't stop talking about race. And that's where I struggle the most. And even though I'm taking this conversation somewhere else, but I struggle the most when I have other brown body individuals that don't understand the Black American experience and thinking that we've done something to deserve somehow the way that we're interacting. Or I've even told, well, why didn't you just listen to the police officers? And why didn't you just conform when a random white person said, hey boy, pull over? You know, why all these different things? And when you don't have that experience, that history, when you don't understand our experience of slavery and civil rights, and this might have been the 10th time this month that I was pulled over, or that you don't have the right to tell me, hey, what are you doing in this neighborhood? Because you don't have authority over me. So even by not having that experience as other brown body individuals, they often don't understand the differences that make a difference of being Black in America. There are a lot of things that we inherit that other immigrant populations don't understand because they grew up in a homogenous environment and race was not a big factor. Any thoughts about that? Just different experiences, even as other brown body individuals. Have you guys had any thoughts of noticing the differences or any conversations around that? Thoughts or reflections? Well, I thought it was important. I thought it was something that I've noticed a lot more, and I've had a lot more conversations about the difference of Black experience. So another question I wanted to ask, and you started off into this, Elsa, is the role of schools in perpetuating racism. And even saying school and racism, those words feel so strong, but it is the reality. It's the reality. Children, Michaela and Nia, you talked about now going to HBCU and people even saying negative things because your college is Black. So let's talk about that a little bit. What is the experience of Black children in schools, and how can we, what is our role in disrupting some of these negative experiences? Educators have such power into influencing our kids, and especially their self-identity. And I remember going into schools and I would see the brown kids being called out and white kids would be talking at the same time. And I would think like, well, why are they being called out? Why are they being publicly shamed? If they did something that was against the rules, why is it publicly in front of the classroom? Why are they not pulled out to the side? Why are they held to different standards than some of our white students? So I wanted to ask each of you guys to think about that, even in your own experience, Michaela and Nia, going to schools as you were younger. What is the experience of kids in schools and connected to race and racism? What did you guys maybe observe personally? And what is our role in changing that? Do you want to start, Elsa? Because you started off talking about your children's different roles. And I also wanted just to think about, did the way that the schools interacted with your kids, did it have anything to do with how light they were? Those that had more lighter skin, did they have more of an easier adjustment in time? Those that were more darker? Maybe just adding some of those things in there, if that made a difference.
So, like I already shared a little bit about Cameron's experience. He's pretty light, but I learned it does not matter. Like, he's a Black boy, and you know, just like what you said, just it was a lot of attention geared towards him about what he was doing. Just again, I really believe like that's where the starting of like the policing of Black and brown bodies starts, is because they were like so hyper focused on every little movement he made, to the point of him tallying on his desk every single thing. And then middle school, being just silly boys with his friends, and he would be the only one sent to the office. And it got to the point where I was like, you don't call, or do not step into that office without me, at the time your stepdad or grandma, on the phone. And this is all in a situation where my mom was an administrator in our school district, and they all knew who my mom was, and it did not matter. And so it got to that point, and finally one day I walked in and I just said, like, this is ridiculous. Like, I am aware of your discipline gap. I'm aware of what all this looks like in schooling and in education for Black kids. Like, I've worked in schools where Black kids are the majority, so this does not happen. Like, what are you doing? And why aren't the rest of those kids in this office or waiting to be seen? Like, where are the rest of the kids that did the exact same thing? Mm-hmm. And of course, they don't have answers. Like, they're just like, we don't know. And so, you know, but having that, I had to learn a lot of language too. And thankfully I had gone through some classes, because I did some different programs and trainings, having been in the school system, that taught me these things. But again, it was like the knowledge and having the tools at my, you know, I just had them. So I had to pull them out and use them to his benefit and try to protect him. And then in high school, there was a situation where there was a substitute. They're allowed to go to the bathroom when they wanted to. He went to go, and the sub said, "You people don't like to be in school," or something like that, to that effect. And he was like, "You people?" And he looked at his friend, and his friend was like, "No, don't." And his friend was Native, and he still was like, "No, I need to go to the bathroom. And also, what did she mean by that?" And so he left, and then he went to the principal's office and just said, "This happened. You know, I left." And the strange thing that happened out of that was, when the teacher came back, if she had a sub, their plan was for that my son would go to a different classroom. And I was like, he was not the problem. Why is he being punished? He's not going to another classroom. He's going to be in the classroom. And we're in a diverse public school system. Like, this is so crazy to me that this was still happening just a few years ago. And that was the teacher's request. And it was like an AP biology class, and he was one of a few kids that weren't white in that classroom. But things like that, talking if he wasn't talking, or if he just, I always taught them, you turn to look at the speaker, and sometimes that meant he'd have to turn in his seat, and he'd get in trouble for that. And I'm like, no, I taught him that. Meanwhile, this white kid walking around the class, nothing ever happened. and it was like so disruptive, and so he really couldn't do anything, whereas these other kids got away with a lot. Now my daughter is the darkest. She's just mostly had stuff happen with being put down in lower groups, like she really couldn't be that high. Yeah, and then her friends kind of doubting that sort of thing, like being told she's not really Black because she's mixed. She doesn't share everything with me at this point because she's 14, but I know that her experience has been a little bit different. When she was younger, she was always the scapegoat. So if there were friend problems, she was always the one that was the instigator, even though it didn't make any sense, like she really wasn't. So hers has been a little bit different. And then Kelvin is my third, and he's lighter. Their dad is half Black, so he's lighter, but he's still like kicked out of the classroom for like really minor things. And the teacher he has is really good. She'll say, like, there was a music teacher that did it a few times, and she said after the first time, like, you realize that whatever trust you had with him is broken. Like, you are going to have to do a lot of restorative work with him because he's already slow to trust, and whatever you had, you already broke it. So having allies within the school was really important, and she's been in our, like I say, our family, because she was at Cameron's first teacher at this school, where it was just about healing and kind of coming back to himself. And I think having those people that are really strong and being able to talk about it when it's really uncomfortable, she's always been a safe place and like willing to have those conversations with kids. And that's made a huge difference for him kind of coming through the school that they're in now. And then my last daughter, she basically is white passing, and she knows that she has a lot of privileges and that people tell her she's not Black, but she kind of gets it on the other side. So she's defending who her dad is, defending who her grandpa is. Like, I know these people are my family, and how does that, for a long time, she really struggled with that. And now she struggles in a different way. It's more social, because she's like, I can wear, if I want box braids someday, I can do that, right? Because I'm part Black. And I'm like, yes, like, it's not gonna be
box braids.
Yeah, but it's like she's kind of grappling with more of the social construct side of it than maybe the schooling or the academic or social. Like, she'll never be seen as Black maybe, but defending her
Blackness.
Her Blackness, yeah.
Yeah. I think, some of the things that you said is having the knowledge and the tools. And I think about as parents that don't have that don't have the knowledge and the tools. And we all know knowledge is power. And so how are they able to advocate for their kids, especially if the kids are being called out in schools injusticely, without injustice, without even reason, and that you had that privilege outside of being white, but you had education, you had knowledge, you had tools, and that came with a lot of power. I remember raising my sister and struggling with her in junior high school and high school, and she would be called out, she would be suspended. And there were things that were her fault, but there are a lot of things that if the school system changed to actually help kids redirect their behaviors and get to the root of why they are acting out in classrooms, she wouldn't need the punishment. And so they focus more on punishment rather than the supports or the root of the issues that's creating kids to show up this way in the classroom. And I just remember coming into those school buildings and them looking at me, because I was in my 20s, but I was educated, but them making decisions on behalf of my sister who I had custody of, because they thought I didn't have to hold the power, and having to always fight and advocate every time. And I did it because I had the knowledge and I had the tools, and it didn't exhaust me. But I think about the parents that don't have that. They don't have those resources, that don't have those tools, and how their children's lives are made. They don't get a choice. Kids get moved to different schools. Kids get moved to different classrooms, and the parents' choice is just taken away. And even having that is just having so much privilege that we often don't think about. I want to ask Michaela and Nia, did you guys have or experience impact of race, or notice that as you guys were growing up in schools as a young kid, maybe in school age? What was the impact of race and how teachers engaged, depending on what school you went to, whether it's high school or school age? What were your experiences?
Well, I went to a private school in high school. So it kind of felt like every time we wanted to have like a race conversation, it would be too sensitive for like the class or like the teachers. It was always too much for them. And you know me, like I'm always trying to advocate. I'm always trying to, well, why? Like I'm always trying to push and question. I was a cheerleader, and so in the beginning of the games, you know that they play the national anthem, and the cheerleaders, we all have to stand with our hand over our heart. I was the only cheerleader that didn't do that, and I was also the captain. I would just stand there.
And what year was this? What year? I'm just trying to
All
search.
4 years, I never did it. All the high school.
Why did you feel like the need not to stand and participate? What did that mean for you?
I could, but I never put my hand over my chest. Like while I was standing with the cheerleaders, I was lined up with them, but I never, when everyone else had their hand over their chest, I just couldn't do it. And that's just because, you know, like I don't like where this country is as far as with African Americans or Black people. I don't think this has ever been the land of the free. So I just don't really agree with that song, that anthem. So I just felt like I didn't have to do it if I didn't want to. My coaches never said anything to me, never pressured me or anything. The other cheerleaders, they would always look at me pretty confused, but you know, it's not really their job to understand. I mean, yeah, they should understand why I don't do it, but you know, it wouldn't change my mind. And also, we will have problems with Black Lives Matter at our school. Like we wanted to wear Black Lives Matter shirts. Mm-hmm. They didn't like that because they thought Black Lives Matter was a political group. Mm-hmm. So they would often say things like, well, you wouldn't want anyone wearing a Trump hat, or you wouldn't want anyone wearing a MAGA hat or pin or whatever, but that's not the same. One group is advocating for my life. One group is saying, hey, stop killing us, you know? So how could you dare to compare those two? So I thought that was kind of really a smack in the face to the students at that school, and it was pretty insensitive. So yeah.
And as a young person, I mean, you're holding so much. This is before you even turned the age of 18 to having to advocate why I don't feel like standing for the flag talks about my freedom. People in my generations before, having to hold the uncomfortableness when race comes up, and having teachers that are supposed to be educated, that are supposed to be able to take care of you, that are supposed to know the impact of race. You're worried about them being uncomfortable. So that's a lot for a young person to be able to hold. And the expectation that you even had to do that, I think that this is the issue right here. The expectation that our brown body children have to be more adult-like. And you're doing it very well, but it's not your role. It's not your job just to do that. Is the role of the systems to change? Is the role of allies to change? Is the role of, hey, this flag means something different for every person. That Black Lives Matter is not a movement. It's about my Black lives, because they haven't mattered historically. And you not having to exhaust yourself before the age of 18, because there's going to be a lot more things that you need to advocate as an adult. I just wanted to pull that out. Like, it's remarkable, the strength that you have. I hear you speak with so much passion. It also it's distraughting that before the age of 18 that you had to do that much, that you had to hold that much.
Exactly. Black children should be Black children. Like, we shouldn't be protesting and marching and advocating. We should be, you know, worried about, you know, school dances and playing tag and, you know, stuff like that. Like, why are we doing all this? It is upsetting. So I understand.
My daughter has not stood for the flag in quite some time, and she's never said the pledge. I've taught them they don't have to, but I remember someone asked her why she didn't, and she was like on a simple basis, if I, as a Black woman in America, I'm gonna make 60 whatever cents on the dollar, is everyone else like that? This isn't my country. Like, this isn't made for me. And she was like 12 when she said this. So it's so much weight that's put on our young Black and brown people to understand, or to carry, and to then explain and to teach, and you know, and I can't even imagine the emotional exhaustion. You know, she's a lot more political and understanding and in this way, like you're explaining, than my son was. and I wonder if it's more with social media and just being so, the idea sharing is so much broader than it was 10 years ago.
I do want to ask you that, like, what gives you courage, Michaela, to stand by what's right at such a young age? I think about me being in Minnesota. I remember we had to stand for the flag, but I wasn't aware of the impact or had the articulation at your age to talk about that this flag doesn't represent me. It was just something that we had to do in school. My generation never thought much about it until I got older into college. But you're talking about before the age of 18. So where does all this courage come from?
Well, my mom. You know, I come from my mom and my grandma. They are two very outspoken women. They will let you know in a heartbeat what it is and what it isn't. They have been educating me since I was very young, like really young. I've been hearing about, you know, the hardships or struggles or, you know, like that we might have to maneuver through as Black people. But they also tried to instill into me Black pride, like be honored that you're Black. It's not a burden, you know? So yeah, I can thank my mom for that. Definitely my mom and grandma.
Yeah. And I think oftentimes we forget about the positiveness of our Blackness and the magicness of our Blackness, and we allow others to shut that down because they're not comfortable with it or they see it as a threat, and not understanding our children need this to survive. I remember reading a study in college, and it talked about the amount of self-esteem and self-worth that Black and brown children have supersedes those of white children, and why that is needed, because we have to fill your cups at home. Because once you go outside of the home, we cannot control how society is going to interact with you. You're even talking about your experience just from an 8-hour school day. So we have to instill Black magic. Our young girls have to talk about their kinky hair and their braids and wearing box braids, that we have to shine higher than the others because we know how society is going to treat us, and that what you get at home is going to shape your experience of how you interact with the world. I remember Michaela's actually my cousin. So her granddad, he gave me so much of what I needed before I even knew I needed it. And I remember sitting on the kitchen table, and me at 5 years old, and I'm talking to my uncle, who is this psychologist, and he's on this school board. And I just held him to he was my hero. And he would ask me at 5, well, what college are you going to? And you are so smart, and you're going to be a psychologist. And just, these were daily conversations that was pulled into me. And I remember him bringing my grandma into the conversation. And my grandma had so much pride and wanted her children and grandchildren to have more educational opportunities than her. That's why she brought us to Minnesota, because she graduated 6th grade. That was the highest that she went. And she would tell us, you need to go to college and you want to go to grad school and all these things that you can do, and that you have the capacity to do that. So that sat with me into my college career, and I ended up going into child psychology after my uncle. And I came with this sense of confidentness. That was what was given to me, was confidence. And so I walk into the room and I'm confident being a Black woman. I'm confident being an educated woman. I'm confident in challenging others. And that has been my protective factor. Because that was given to me. And then I also think about our children that don't get that, though, that don't have parents that have that capacity because they weren't given that. So when me and Michaela are talking, we're talking about generations that pass this down. So what happens when we don't have a generation that has the capacity to stop the negative cycles? What do those kids do? And how, this is why I wanted to go back to you, Elsa, like, what is our role actually in changing the systems? Because Michaela, you've done your individual role, and Elsa, you're done your individual role as a mother, but we're not really changing systems. We're maybe changing people's thought processes, or we're challenging others, but systems are not really being changed. And so what is our role in actually being able to influence systems that are creating these barriers for our children, that are making our children more adult-like? What do we do?
I don't know if I know the answer to that. I think that it's probably multifaceted. I asked personally to go in and talk to the school that my kids go to now is not the school that ran my son down. It's the same school district, but it's our neighborhood school. And something that really resonated with me when we moved there is that the principal was a Black woman. And so when I walked in and I said, this is happening, she was just like, yep. Like I could just see that I didn't have to explain it. I didn't have to say like, this is how it's impacting him. She was just like, yep, I know. And I didn't have to justify why I wanted things to be different for him or the kids that were going to come through next. And I don't know the answer, but I know that made a big impact on his experience there, because it was about healing and coming back to himself. That was my primary goal. And then I knew academically he would follow. Unfortunately, she did not stay in our school, but I do think that putting Black people in positions of, power, whether it's principalship or superintendents, where they can start to influence down, I think that's made a difference, because when he was at the middle school, it was a white principal, or the APs were not Black, but now the principal is Black, and then he has administration. He's created a different system in place so that, like, instead of behavior supports, they have student coaches, and all the kids go to them instead of like the counselors are now just basically academic advisors. But especially the Black kids just go to these people because they don't have to over explain. If a teacher says something, they're just like, this was said and this is what happened, and then they handle it peer to peer rather than making the kid explain it. And I think that made a huge difference for her compared to what my son went through.
Well, you're changing the system. I mean,
it was a system change. Yeah,
the system is changing. It's not for the kid to advocate or the parent to advocate, and that's just one teacher. But it's actually changing the system of how schools are intervening, and it's not punishment. It's about giving these children space to be their authentic self, but to deal with some of their social and emotional issues. I think every episode I've mentioned Lucy Laney, but I love that they have that boxing ring in the school. I think that's awesome. I don't know, Michaela and Nia, you heard about it, but when kids are going through adversity at home, or when they need to release their energy, it's giving them a positive outlet for that. So instead of forcing them to sit down in the classroom and they need to be able to release that energy, that they built that into their curriculum system. That's changing the system, holding teachers actually accountable. That's changing the system.
I was going to say, after George Floyd was murdered, each school in our school district held like community conversations for the people that attended the school, the parents. Some kids joined in, but they were like, what do we, it was multifaceted, and then the conversations have carried on district-wide. And but I stayed after and I talked to the principal, and she hasn't been there very long, but I was just like, where is the accountability going to come from? Because I don't care if you're teaching about that music teacher or a classroom teacher or a recess monitor, whoever it may be, there has to be accountability. And it's often those people that are less invested, like the lunchroom and the recess monitors, who are really targeting my son and others like him. And then there's nothing. And I'm like, I understand you need bodies and you need staff, but there have to be consequences. And then parents need to understand what that's going to look like for their children. And that to me is where parents really can start. And that's when I'm in these groups, I'm like, parents all have to start asking for this, because it may not be your kid, but it's your kid's friend. And that was who started really noticing it for Cameron when he was young, was his friends were saying things like, all the teachers hate him. We all love him, all the kids love him, but all the teachers really don't like him, and we don't understand why. And even the lunch lady, and even this, and it was like, that doesn't make sense. Why can you not like a child? And so I think demanding that accountability within the school system is very, very important. And that also has to come with an openness from those that can influence that too.
Yeah, it becomes an expectation instead of something like, this is something extra. It's an expectation that you understand our Black and brown children, that you understand our culture, and that teachers are held accountable when their cultural misinterpretations, when they're going against our cultural norms, that they're actually held accountable. Another thing I'm thinking about is that those parents that do have the knowledge and the tools, that you advocate for all brown and Black children. You're not just doing it for your child, but you're learning how to advocate for all children. So you're making those big, massive impacts. I want to ask Tessa and Nia and Michaela, and just even you chime in, Elsa, like this, I've said this in almost every episode, it feels different this time around. I think we as Brown and Black communities are getting a lot of exposure. I think we're having a lot of talks, but talks don't lead to action. So what I want to ask is that, do you guys feel like in this era that we are now, and I'm specifically talking about post George Floyd, is change possible? I think about me working with organizations before the incident and the brutal murder of George Floyd and afterwards, and it feels like white individuals in power are a little bit more open to hear, taking some ownership. Change is happening. It's not necessarily happening at the speed that we need to happen to, but even having public conversations like we're having right now on Facebook Live with a diverse group, it's different, right? And we are starting to demand some changes. And as a community, we are joining together in solidarity. So do you guys feel like where we're at today is change possible? What your experiences, Tess, Michaela, Nia, or even Elsa, just to talk about it. Where are we? And do you guys feel like we have a momentum right now for change? You want to talk, Tess?
Sure, yeah. I hope so, of course. I mean, I think that like, I've never experienced this before. When I was talking to my mom about it, she was comparing it to, you know, the 60s, and she was in Houston, and she says it feels really similar, and she said that it feels bigger and it feels more possible now. And yeah. I think that, you know, maybe it's with the addition of social media and with this like way that we can communicate, I hope that is a big enough difference, and that'll kind of tip it over the edge to get some real change going. But at the same time, when everything first started happening, I was talking to my friend who's a Black mother. She lives in California, and I asked her if she was feeling hopeful, and she was like, "That's a really complicated question, Tess." And then she basically like listed all the ways that racism has hurt her and affected her life, and it felt kind of naive of me to even ask that question, you know, because I'm, you know, so new to this conversation. I come in and I'm like, "How you doing? Aren't you happy that like things are changing?" And she's like, "Oh, this is my life," and and you know, she has a more realistic expectation. But I do think that there is a significant thing happening now, you know. I really do. And there's been changes in local organizing across the country. Things are, you know, with police and things like that. So I think that there are also, as well as the feeling of difference, it seems that there's also tangible differences happening. I think. I'd like to hear from, yeah.
I think there is. I don't want to get us into that we are just responding because of there's publicity. I want us, you know, as a society to think about sustainable change that makes the impact. When I even think about police officers in schools, you know, many people say, well, just remove them. But I think about majority of police officers that are in the schools wanted that position, and some of them do a good job. And so we can't create these cookie cutter approaches of just reacting. We really would have to say, well, what do we need? Do they need more training? Maybe they need not to be not uniformed. Those that are already positive aspects, especially the male police officers in the schools that understand the community, that come from the community. It can't be a one for all. So I think we're starting to get into that cycle with change, is that we're just kind of making big decisions and we're not really thinking about the impact everywhere. But I do start to see some policy changes. I even think about, you know, words have meaning. So when we say defund the police, what does that really mean? Are we educating people of what that means, what that looked like? What we really want is that we want police officers that live in the community, that represent the community, that understand that community. We want them to go back to community officing, serving and protecting, getting training, not responding out of fear. They should get psychological testing. I mean, like these are concrete examples of where I at least feel change needs to happen. It feels a lot different to me, and I'm gonna tell you my personal. Just last week, I went to see the memorial, and when I walked to the one that is on 37th and Park Avenue that has all the tombstones of many Black, brown, and brown people that have been murdered, the first thing that hit me is that I probably didn't know 5% of the people. And that was very, very surprising, that I could probably only name 10, and there's probably about 100 tombstones there. The second thing is that it just felt like literally a spiritual presence, just being in that space, and the humbleness when people come, knowing that it's not physical bodies there, but it's a representation of so many Black lives that have been lost by police violence, and people are honoring it, and it's like a spiritual land, and you can just feel the presence. And then as you walk down Chicago Avenue and you see the list of names of those that have been murdered, and you get right there to the middle of the street and you have the memorial for George Floyd, it's been so much honor. When I was there last week, I was talking to a family that flew from Tennessee, never been to Minnesota, never knew anything personal about the families, but wanted to make sure that they showed their kids what this meant. So for me, that feels like change is coming, because we are actually honoring Black people publicly for one time. But what do you think, Nia, Michaela? You guys are the younger generation. Do you guys feel hopeful? Do you feel like change is possible?
I definitely feel like change is possible, and it just makes me think of how when George Floyd first passed, it sparked this huge movement. And, you know, it wasn't just people in America that were protesting anymore. There were people, you know, in China and, you know, all these other countries around the world. And people are really starting to wake up like, oh, like this is how African Americans are treated in the United States. You know, but I also feel like change has to come from inside out. So I feel like it has to start with the systems that are in place right now, like even judges, because, you know, it affects us on so many levels. And I just feel like they have to start first, if that makes sense. We're definitely voicing our opinion that, you know, this has to stop, like, but I feel like it still at the end of the day starts with them, because they're the ones who pretty much hold the power that affects us every day, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. It makes total sense. I think what makes me think of it, how do you help those that have not lived in our bodies make sense of lived experiences? So even when I'm training, I try to think about, when I walk into majority of white audiences, how do I help them make sense of the Black and brown body experience? And the first thing I think of is they gotta want it. They gotta want to change. They gotta want to have the information. They also have to have ownership of what you inherit, your privilege and your power. The defensive mechanisms have to come down. Ownership of just what you represent. Like Tessa said, as a white body person, you may have not intentionally done any harm, but you represent harm. You gotta hold that. And then you also have to understand it's not about you right now. It's not, because this America has been built around you. And so for the first time, we're actually focusing on brown and Black body individuals. And so until we can have people in position of power willing to let go of some of that power, willing to let go of some of that comfort, change is going to be very, very difficult. And this is why we have to start to set standards in place that, you know, police officers have to do these trainings. And it's not just training, it's coaching, it's reflecting. If they don't pass the biases test, they should not be in that community. They don't live in the community. They should not be in the community. Like, start to actually create these standards, because again, it goes back to, this is not a movement. This is our life, and all of our lives matter. And we have youth, and we have adults, and we have caregivers and allies, and we are all forming this solidarity around lives of Black and brown individuals. And now it's time to hold people accountable for being different. Also, thoughts, or Michaela, about change? Is change possible where we're at, especially post George Floyd?
It's really hard for me to have this conversation, because I talk to my mom a lot about this too, about change in the system. And I'm not gonna lie, I get a little discouraged sometimes, because I think about my grandma, who's like 83, who still she watched the marches with Dr. King on TV. Yeah. And so now she's watching marches in 2020 in Minneapolis. Like, it's like, it's just
discouraging. Yeah. I said it feels discouraging.
It feels really discouraging, but it's like, my mom often tells me, she's like, well, you can't get discouraged, Kelly, you got to keep going. It's like, okay, like, you know, it sucks that that's what the world is, but, you know, I'm in a group, I'm in a political action group right now, and they often talk about how we could change the system. They actually think we should branch off and create our own system, like, but that's kind of it's just it's a little hard when you don't have I feel like it'll be hard to create change without like a leader.
Yeah.
A leader to lead everyone. But then again, it's like my mom tells me, she's like, well, there could be a leader, but they'd probably kill him.
Mm.
And, you know, I'm sorry to be so blunt, but, you know, this is the world we live in. You know, this country is rooted in this absurd notion of white supremacy. It's like a stain on this country. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of, we're trying to remove this stain. We're trying to get it up, but we can't. It's like it's just rooted there. So it's like, what do we do? And I'm still in the process of trying to figure out, what do you do?
Yeah. I think one thing is getting a better understanding of what we can control, and that we all have different places to intervene. And that's where you start. We can't try to work on everything, but what can you directly influence? If you are a student, reflecting those student body groups. If you're a parent, being able to support parent groups. If you're an ally and an intern, the things that you can influence. I think we try to get so big, and then change doesn't happen. It definitely doesn't sustain itself. So when I think about it, I said, you know what? I wanted to start Life Talks. It was for brown body individuals, about brown body individuals, unapologetically Black. That was important for me. Being able to have the opportunities to actually train some police officers in different cities and start to hold them accountable. Actually, what does that mean once training has happened? It's not a one and done, but it's actually the way that you're interacting with the community. So I think we have to be having tangible ways that we can influence, and once you're a part of those systems, that believing in yourself that you have made that difference, I think we get this kind of hopelessness, because you're not seeing the big changes, especially as you see that there's a president in office that has increased the polarization in America. But we cannot allow individuals like that to stop us from our mission, to stop us from making these changes, from even us celebrating the changes and the interventions that we have. And so I always try to tell people, compartmentalize your change. What can you control? What can you influence? Don't get into too much too soon, because it does feel discouraging. And you're right, your grandma has seen a lot of decades. And I always think history repeats itself because we allow it to. So let's not allow it. Let's keep moving. Let's keep fighting for it. Elsa, what are your thoughts? Change possible.
I feel like you finding the place where you feel like you can make the most change is important, because you just can't. We only have our reach that we have. So I was struggling with this a little bit, like, oh, this is important, this is important, this is important. I want to be in on all of it, and also then like personal relationships, and try to have my place there. And it's like, okay, I just had to stop and be like, okay, this is not sustainable or doable for me. Primarily, I'm trying to help my kids, and then where do they go next? School. So, and then in the community. So making sure that our community is safe for them, and where does that go for me? And so I think that personal story is really important. And so some things that I think we can do is insert ourselves where we are able, and sharing, like, you know, schools, for example, they have staff development days. So maybe it's taking some of those stories and hearing from people with real experiences to like personalize it and let them know, like, this is really happening. And I think when you can, unfortunately, the more personal it is, the more effective it is sometimes. And I think using relationship to affect change is really important. And I think where I see change kind of slowly starting to happen has been in those arenas. So systemically, I feel kind of like Michaela, it is very discouraging. I would like to think that there will be enough movement and push to make change, but the system is so structured and so embedded, like white supremacy is so embedded in our system that I almost feel like we'd literally have to like undo everything and then start rewriting things that will protect everybody, you know, and the right people, and not exclude. And I don't think that'll happen, but you know, where we can, I think we do have more ability to make or affect even small changes. Even in our little district, they offer like an history from the African American perspective. and we're a suburban school, like, but because of the population, I don't know where that came from, but someone asked for it at some point. So a lot of kids take it, and you know, at the elementary levels, they're embedding more unspoken narratives or like those excluded narratives into every single subject, whether it's math all the way up through history, to show that that there are stories that we've left out and that they can see themselves in history. So all of those things happen because somebody somewhere said we have to do this. And so I do think in that way we can start to affect change, even if they feel a little small, but they're, you know, for kids, those are really important ways to see themselves.
And I think what you brought up about just having accurate depictions of history in the schools, especially with school agers and elementary schools, that really talks about Brown and Black body history, the history of Indigenous and Native Americans in Minnesota, and positive aspects, right? Positive aspects of what it is, that you don't have to have another class to learn about that. That is it is American history. And even in colleges, I think about the curriculums that are in a lot of these colleges, we don't talk about historical trauma. We don't talk about African-American experience or Native. It's always something you have to take extra. And so it becomes like, what they call it, the supplemental classes. It's not a part of the core curriculum. And so at what point are we going to expect it and demand it as part of the core curriculum?
Well, even like, I think I heard at an early childhood conference, when they were looking at cited resources, they were always like often white men. And there are people that are doing this work. And so outside of white men and white women, so the students started asking for them, like, where are some of these resources? And it was because of that the professor was like, I don't know, and I obviously need to do some work. So it shouldn't be supplemental. It should be literally just part of what we teach and what we're learning, and just everything.
Yeah.
But it's not hard. That's what surprises me is like Lewis and Clark. Why can't we include one of whoever had their slave along, and he was the reason why they made it where they made it? Like, that doesn't really change the story so deeply that we can't include it. Like, it's just, it doesn't take away from I don't know. It seems so easy, but for some reason, I think it goes back to the power, giving up power and your place, and people really just want to like hang on to that.
Yeah. And our society is rooted in whiteness being rightness. I mean, Michaela, you said something like that. And so we gotta wipe that away. There's a quote, there's an article I was reading, and she it'll sum up our episode 3, but she said, racism is endemic. It's always going to reinvent itself in creative ways. Some people find that very depressing, but I believe it relieves us from the pressure of having to eliminate racism in our lifetime. The goal is to intervene with an eye towards justice and abolition. And I believe that. I don't think it's going to go away by me taking my last breath on this earth. I think it's going to pop up in different avenues, but we don't let that discourage us. That's why we find our role where we can impact, influence, and continue to push and put pressure, and to continue to gain not just allies, but active change agents, because unfortunately we do have a society that whiteness has more power. And so being able to not just utilize your power, but letting go of some of those powers, removing yourself from positions of power and putting a person of color in that position, utilizing your voice to be able to intervene and add standards and add these trainings and make them things that are standards in our education system. So what is your role? What can you do? How can you influence those things? And I believe that we'll start to have some movement. Our time is coming to an end, and like always, I always enjoy these talks. I feel like we can talk for hours. But for me, episode 3 was really about many voices, but one goal. And the goal was moving away from movements to understanding that our lives are being impacted and that we are obligated to make a difference for our future of brown and Black babies. So I want to thank all of you for coming on here. I want to thank you, Elsa and Michaela and Nia, for sharing your personal stories. Tess, I want to thank you for being so courageous. This is our first time. But I just want to ask you guys, have any one last word check out to give to the Life Talks audience today that summed up our talk today? Anything that is left on your mind, or any one last hope that you can give to people that are listening to this episode? If anybody wants to say anything.
I guess I would say that, right now we're all kind of like getting like sucked into social media, and like I heard it called doom scrolling the other day, just like feeling awful and just looking at everything. And it doesn't help anybody for us to lose all of our energy. You know, it doesn't help anybody for us to be so beaten down by the world. And if you find yourself, I mean, I guess I'm speaking to other white people. If you find yourself so beaten down, you're not going to help fight racism, you know, if you're exhausted. So take a deep breath, go for a walk, put your mask on and go outside. And then maybe the next morning, check back in and see what Black organization you can help support that day. It doesn't help anybody to just exhaust yourself.
I wholeheartedly believe in, I call it protecting your energy. And if your cup is depleted, how are you going to fill other people's cups? And we often forget we're still in the whole pandemic of COVID-19 and social isolation and depression, all those things that come. So Tess, you're absolutely right. Being able to give yourself permission to pause is so important. Breaking away from CNN, CNBC's, all the ends in all of the media, because that can be very, very heavy and create a lot of depression and negative emotions and feelings. So allowing yourself space to feel goodness, to enjoy family, to enjoy friends, even if it's from a distance, that's very powerful. So thanks, Tess. Elsa or Michaela or Nia, any last minute thoughts?
I mean, well, I guess to just my young African-American peers, I just would like to say, you know, just keep your head up, you know, like Tupac said. I love him. Just, you know, stay proud. That's the most thing, you know, just stay proud.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Nia or Elsa?
I'll just say really quick, it's okay to not always read anti-racism work by Black people. Like, there is so much art created and so much beauty, like you mentioned, that we can tap into, and so many other people doing really powerful work that's not necessarily just focused on anti-racism. So I tend to get really deep into it, and now I've had to step away, and I'm reading Love Always by Bell Hooks, and it's really lovely. And I just think it's really, we forget that there's more to offer than just kind of this heavy stuff. And so it's just another way to support and learn.
The powerful, the positive influences of our brownness. So I started to smile because this is local. Maya Michelle is local, and she wrote a book called Your Hue Looks Good on You. And I absolutely love this book. She also has a song called Hey Pretty, local Minneapolis, but it just talks about loving yourself and the skin that you're in. And I think we forget all of our magic and all the positive historical and current influences that we have. And then there's this other book called Being Unapologetically You. These have been my two favorite resources, but it just reminds me that there are so many positiveness about being brown, and I wouldn't ask to be any other culture. And I want every brown and Black girl to feel that magic, to love themselves, to love your purple hair, your kinky hair, your braids, whoever you are, to bring that authenticity in every environment. So yes, absolutely. And last but not least, Nia.
You kind of took my last point. I was going to say, it's not a burden to be Black, you know, be unapologetically you, and, you know, just love yourself. Love yourself.
Absolutely. I want to thank you guys again for attending Life Talks episode 3. We air every Wednesday. Our last episode of this series, Supporting Black and Brown Babies, will be airing next Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. See you next Wednesday for Life Talks. Thank you guys for coming. Bye.